Okay, listen. 2004 was the finest year in the history of British entertainment. There was Shaun of the Dead, the greatest zombie apocalypse film of all time. That film where Danny Dyer plays a football hooligan who sees the future in his dreams.
What the fuck was that dream all about?
And then, of course, there was Britain's Hardest, the series where Phil Mitchell from EastEnders sought to find the toughest geezer in the land. The maddest lad. Britain's Hardest. And in order to find Britain's Hardest, these men were subjected to a series of elimination challenges. Challenges like hanging from a thing for some time, sticking your head underwater for some time, and of course, what would any hardman competition be without a good game of who can kick the most doors down in the least possible time? They put graffiti on the doors to make them look harder. The finals were then settled with a good old-fashioned rumble-tumble where the winner would be crowned Britain's Hardest. Now, you could say that this series had a few moments of floppiness. It's hard to tell whether Phil is trying to speak like a hard man or is more of an ASMR artist for closeted football hooligans.
54 hard men over 10 shows, but only one can be Britain's Hardest.
And with the unfortunate title of the series, it's difficult to take some of the dialogue seriously when you start thinking of the word hard as a euphemism. Wait, no, don't do that. Because if you do that, you'll ruin the entire program.
So we all think we're hard, do we? Well, hard is only hard until harder shows up.
It doesn't matter how hard you think you are. There's always somebody out there who's that little bit harder.
But to be the hardest, there has to be someone less hard. And this ring is only big enough for 2 hard men. I'm one.
So don't try and copy anything you've seen. Leave the hard stuff to the hard men. So, this is it. The end of the road. It's been long, and it's been hard. But not as hard as our winner.
Now look, I know you guys aren't especially sensitive, but in case some of you are, I want you to know that this isn't going to be an attack on the broader hard man community. I love hard men. I myself am a hard man. Grumble, grumble. But I do think most people would agree that hardness is really just something you would pursue for its own sake. It's something you do for fun. But you wouldn't go around attaching some grandiose meaning to being hard. You'd have to be a real monkey brain to see hardness as, say, the foundation of a good society. To see people like this as the architects of great civilizations. On a completely unrelated note, let's talk about Joe Rogan. Part 1. The Hard Men. On November 27th, 2021, Joe Rogan went on Instagram.com and posted this image of a political compass overlaid with the words good times, weak men, hard times, strong men. Beside it, he wrote, "We are in Kali Yuga, the age of conflict. All of the chaos we're seeing right now was predicted in Hinduism thousands of years ago. Civilizations move in predictable cycles, and we are in the lower left-hand square of the chart. Do your best to elevate yourself and the world around you from the madness that is in the air, but understand that this insanity is all a part of an infinite process." On the image, the good times were placed in the libertarian right quadrant, the weak men were in the libertarian left, the hard times were the authoritarian left, and the strong men were in the authoritarian right. As the original saying goes, hard times create strong men create good times create weak men create hard times. So, what the fuck does that mean? Well, really it depends on who you ask. To hard men like me, and indeed to most of my hard friends, it's an extremely inaccurate and oversimplified trope that isn't really useful for anything. But for other people, it's a very serious statement about society and human history. As the story goes, great civilizations are built up by strong men. The wealth and comforts of those civilizations give rise to a generation of weak men. Those weak men bring that civilization to collapse, and amongst the ruins, the hard times spawn a generation of strong men who have to rebuild the good times, and so the cycle continues. Joe Rogan seems especially keen on this story, and that quote is one that he's recited on his podcast quite a few times.
Hard times create hard men. Hard men create soft times. Soft times create soft men. Soft men create hard times. We are now around soft men in hard times. People think that you should be weak and you should be docile. No, you should be a monster and then learn how to control it. It's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. This doesn't mean that you can't be kind if you're strong, but it does mean you can't be strong if you're weak.
So first, where does this saying actually come from? Well, it's definitely not an ancient saying. Believe it or not, the quote was first coined in 2016 in a post-apocalyptic novel called Those Who Remain. So its origin actually comes from a work of fiction, but since then, people in the non-fiction world have already made a move to adopt it for themselves. Like this book from 2019 called Hard Times Create Strong Men, which has a Spartan helmet on the cover, a parental advisory sign, and another sign saying,
Warning! Do not read this book if you are easily offended. Burn this book instead.
I think he's trying to tell you this is a book for hard men. Why does he think it's so offensive? Oh, because there's a chapter about 63 genders. I wonder what he thinks the 63 genders are, but I'm definitely not going to pay £18.64 to find out. Luckily, he has a free audiobook version on his website where he lists every single one.
Below is a list of the proposed 63 genders of the modern day. Masculine homosexual man, masculine heterosexual man, masculine bisexual man, feminine homosexual man, feminine heterosexual man, feminine bisexual man, androgyne homosexual man, androgyne heterosexual man, androgyne bisexual andro female, androgyne bisexual androdite, androgyne bisexual hermaphro male, androgyne bisexual hermaphro female.
Chapter 18.
Rampant homosexuality.
Okay, so maybe this is low-hanging fruit. In any case, the quote itself might be new, but it definitely wasn't an original thought. The idea itself is far older, and surprisingly easy to find in popular culture. Take The Lord of the Rings. Here, the strongmen of Numenor build the city of Minas Tirith, which they originally called Minas Anor, of course. Not gonna get me, you Lord of the Rings dorks. The line of kings born of good times behind the city walls fall in vanity. The rule of Gondor is handed over to weak men who sit in great halls binging on exploding tomatoes, and a kingdom on the brink of collapse has to be saved by a strong Dunedain ranger forged in the hard conditions of the north. It also rings through the story of the Free Men in June, this 5-piece series of paintings on the fall of Rome, this very bluntly titled painting called The Romans in Their Decadence, and if you really want, you can buy it as a bedsheet and pillow cover. Mate, who the f***? But as well as being a massive red flag on first dates or the bane of history teachers around the world, this trope is a surprisingly popular way of looking at society. As we're about to find out, variations of it have existed for thousands of years, and its impact on the world goes far deeper than you might think. So let's get hard with it. Grumble, grumble. Part 2. Ancient Rome. When I was 14 years old, our history teacher asked us the question, why didn't the Romans conquer Scotland? To which I, a fledgling internet shitlord, said, was it because the Scots were mental? And she replied, no, they were no more mental than you're being right now. Loner box, you manlet, you dense piece of shit. So I got owned. In a way, it was almost a trick question. Before Hadrian's Wall was built, the Romans had quite a strong presence in Scotland for around 80 years, and it was a pretty one-sided contest, as was shown in the Battle of the Grampian Hills, where the Romans killed around 10,000 Caledonians at the cost of only 360 casualties. If the uneven terrain and cold weather and lack of urban development could count as the hard times, it definitely wasn't producing the hardest men. The truth is, there just wasn't that much to gain from holding Scotland, especially for the cost of bringing a fairly backwards population under Roman government and trade. Now, of course, Alba Gebrath and all that shit, but in this case, Scotland just wasn't worth the effort. In other words, it was the harsh conditions, the hard times that kept the Romans out, rather than the hardness of the people living there. But nevertheless, Rome was ultimately defeated by people who were less developed, less urbanized, and poorer. As the trope goes, the wealth of the Romans had given them a life of luxury and hedonism, which made them bad at fighting for some reason, whereas the Goths, Vandals, and Huns lived a more simple lifestyle, which made them good at fighting for some reason. The problem is, the fall of Rome at the hands of semi-nomadic beefcakes is only the exception, not the rule. We may all know about the people who succeeded against Rome, but we're a lot less likely to remember, say, these people. That long list of non-state people who the Romans either defeated, subjugated, or just wiped off the face of the earth. So the idea that Rome's opponents were these stateless, back-to-basics super soldiers just doesn't hold up. For as long as they existed, the Romans were pretty much always the deadliest fighters around. The problem here is that history just tends to remember winners more than losers, especially winners who can give you a good story. And a relatively poor semi-nomadic people rising up against the greatest empire that ever was is always going to be more captivating than big empire fights small village and wins. In the same way, we all remember how the Mongols conquered China, but what we don't remember is that Mongol rule over China barely lasted 100 years. The other 2,500 years would be spent being forced to live in the difficult conditions of the Eurasian steppe. Because that's the rule. And despite the selective memory of history, a developed state, for all its luxury and decadence, will come out on top against semi-nomadic tribespeople almost every time. But nonetheless, the idea of good times giving rise to a generation of self-destructive hedonists has been a go-to narrative for conservative revisionists since the 18th century. But what's really weird is that this mistake was also being made by the Romans themselves. Let's look at some examples of Roman men being weird about men. Part 3. Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was a former Roman dictator who ruled from 49 to 44 BC. Former, that's good. And just for context, the fall of Rome wouldn't happen for another 500 years. And Julius Caesar was a hard man, with a very long and very hard military career. And who better to ask about that military career than the man himself? In his book on the Gallic War, Caesar describes his encounters with a diverse range of tribespeople who opposed Roman conquest. In particular, he had very kind words to say about the Belgae, Helvetii, and Suebi, whom he described, in one way or another, as the hardest men. And he was very clear about why he thought they were so odd. The Belgae, he said, were the bravest because they are the furthest from the civilization and refinement of our province, and merchants least frequently resort to them and import those things which tend to effeminate the mind. He said the Helvetii surpassed the rest of the Gauls in valor, and that the Suebi were the most warlike nation of all the Germans. The problem here was, Caesar annihilated all of these people. Like, no contest. Really, the people who gave him far more trouble were the Arverni, who lived very close to the Roman frontier, meaning they will have had plenty of access to all of those feminizing goods, whatever the f they were. So why did he give so much more credit to the tribespeople? Well, because as well as being a hard man, Julius Caesar was a politician. And the opponents he spoke the most highly of also happened to be his first opponents. And by making them out to be a group of hardened super soldiers, Caesar was able to oversell his achievements as a military leader. He was hyping them up as a way of hyping up himself, which was not very hard man behavior. What this really was a sophisticated, cosmopolitan public relations campaign. He was bending the truth to further his political career. Not like a hard man, but like a liberal. Like a woman. Part 4. Germania. Before we get into the... Don't mind the very subtle music choice, by the way, that's nothing. Before we get into this, I want to suggest a theory. Every time someone tries to blame the fall of Rome on something they don't like about the modern world, their timeline will be off by at least a few hundred years. People blame all kinds of things for the fall of Rome: hedonism, welfare, immigration, but of course, most of these things existed in Rome for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Roman history is long, with periods of dominance, instability, recovery, expansion, and preservation. And the fall of Rome itself lasted around 100 years, which isn't even to mention the Eastern Roman Empire, which survived for another 1,000 years. To blame the collapse on this or that thing which also exists in modern society is bound to run into problems. It's still not uncommon for people to blame the fall on ostentatious wealth and decadence, like shagging. But the emperors associated with that time, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, mostly ruled in the 1st century. If there was any sign of Rome falling, it wouldn't be for another couple of hundred years. And once again, this blockheaded theory wasn't born out of modern revisionists, but within ancient Rome itself. And no one stands more guilty of this offense than a man called Cornelius Tacitus. Over 100 years after Julius Caesar was complaining about the effeminate minds of Roman men and then using those effeminate men to wipe out every army that crossed his path, Tacitus was making a very similar observation of his own. In 98 AD, he wrote a series called Germania, where he gives an account on a collection of independent tribes living north of the Rhine. Tacitus saw Rome as a civilization in decay. The wealth and comforts offered by Rome's success had produced a generation spoiled by vice and vanity. The good times had created weak men. The people of Germania, on the other hand, were held up by Tacitus as the answer to Roman failings. With their fierce-looking blue eyes, reddish hair, and big frames, they had become accustomed to cold weather and hunger. They had little interest in silver or gold, and they didn't care for the appearances of their horses and armor. Their commanders relied on valor and example rather than the authority of their rank. Their biggest virtue was courage, and their biggest disgrace was cowardice, so much so that many who survived in battle had ended their shame by hanging themselves. Where the Romans were promiscuous and polyamorous, the Germanic people were monogamous and chaste. Their strict moral code meant that the people of Germany had never contaminated themselves by intermarriage with foreigners, but remained of pure blood, distinct and unlike any other nation. Whoa. Straight from their childhood, they were hard men, born of hard times. However, Tacitus never went to Germania. It's very unlikely that he ever went north of the Rhine, and there's no evidence that he even knew any of their language. The notion that Germanic people were ethnically pure is completely false, given that they were no strangers to raiding and pillaging themselves, unless they really were leaving all the women alone in the process. No. His general knowledge of their customs and practices is sketchy at best, which is probably bound to happen when you're lumping a bunch of tribes under one umbrella. So what Tacitus is doing here is not ethnography. He's fantasizing about hard men. As for the decline of Rome he's talking about, the question you'd have to ask is, what decline? Germania was published in 98 AD, meaning that Tacitus was writing about Roman decline right at the beginning of the empire and only 2 years before the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, a line of rulers so successful that they became known as the 5 good emperors. The hard times, if any, wouldn't come until the 3rd century crisis, which, even then, ended with Rome stabilizing and regaining its old borders. Needless to say, Germania was a flop, and it even disappeared until it was rediscovered in 1425. But by the 16th century, Tacitus and his fantasies about Germans would find a new meaning in an age of modern nationalism. His notion of a distinct German identity was especially helpful during the Protestant Reformation, even better so because it defined Germans against Italians, and the fact that quite a lot of what Tacitus said was complete bullshit didn't really matter so long as it provided a flattering story for the creation of a German Volk. The 19th century nationalist Friedrich Kohlrausch described Tacitus and his work as a temple of honor to the German nation. The people weren't just Bavarians or Prussians anymore, they were Germans. They were the earthly gods who the Romans could never overcome. Which isn't entirely true, but, nationalism. The idea of the Germanic people as ethnically pure, which Tacitus doesn't even really elaborate on, would find a new significance in the world of pseudoscientific racism. The image of the culturally and genetically exceptional German naturally became a centerpiece for people from a certain political persuasion. In fact, these wallopers were so taken by this story that they decorated the halls of Nuremberg with quotes from Germania, which is kind of like Live, Laugh, Love, but for genocidal war criminals. Oh yes, these strong men validated themselves with quotes from a man who was fantasizing about people he never met. And in 1943, when the Allies were advancing towards Italy, Heinrich Himmler sent a crack SS team into the country to retrieve an original manuscript of Germania. When they arrived, the estate where the text was kept had already been abandoned. And knowing how important Germania was, the SS assumed that it had to have been taken away by the estate owner when he left. They did a very brief search of the building and returned home empty-handed. It turned out the manuscript was sitting in a chest in the basement. Hard men. Okay, so hopefully we've seen there are at least a few flaws with this idea, but unfortunately, the hard men trope is still more or less a mainstream belief. And while the thought of grumpy professors having to fail the history essays of Joe Rogan fans is very funny, it does make you wonder, were these people the only ones who allowed this idea to influence their political decisions? And if not, what else could happen if people who think like this end up in positions of power? Part 5. Pepsi Cola versus death.
The Japanese soldier is, after all, a human being. Before the war started, he was classified as a rather fine type of almost human ape. Imitative, brave, but without originality, capable only of fighting according to the set of exercises of the book, and easily beaten by the superior resources and initiative of the white races. After the considerable battering the white races represented in the Far East received in the 4 months following Pearl Harbor, opinion swung the other way. The became a superman, a master of jungle warfare, capable of living for months on a handful of rice, brilliant, resourceful, and entirely without fear.
In the Second World War, the Americans went through a very interesting journey of anti-Japanese racism. Initially, the stereotype was one of a weak, regressive people who were late to industrialize and weighed down by old cultural traditions. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the attitude of American politicians towards the Japanese had radically shifted. Where they were typically seen as a backward race not to be taken seriously on the world stage, the trauma of Pearl Harbor seemed to have pushed Americans to see the Japanese in a completely different light. They were now seen as bloodthirsty super soldiers with inhuman levels of courage. The samurai had returned with guns and planes. The kamikazes played a big part in this fantasy, which is slightly sad, given that they weren't so much hard men as they were terrified young boys who were forced into badly built planes by a tyrannical state. But the myth of the Japanese super soldier did come in handy a few years later in helping the American public to stomach the use of atomic bombs. Western powers have always been guilty of Orientalist attitudes, and sometimes it's understandable. After all, if the strongest military power on Earth is struggling in countries like Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, of course it's tempting for them to say that their enemies might just be a little bit odder. Sometimes the stereotype of Eastern hordes carved out of scarcity and struggle becomes the easiest answer. And there are some ways you could try to justify it. If you look at the number of insurgencies fought by America since 1776, their success rate has improved massively in the last few decades. Maybe the US troops are really not as hard as they used to be. And maybe Joe Biden's they-them army really wouldn't last 10 minutes against Russia. No, you unpatriotic f***. A much better answer for this would have just been the Cold War, because then insurgencies against the US were still underdogs, but they did at least have the backing of international superpowers. And of course today, people are making a very similar case for the failure in Afghanistan. It's easy to forget that the Taliban were defeated in less than 10 weeks in 2001, during which the US only had 4 combat deaths. Whatever reasons they had for their ultimate failure in Afghanistan, the hardness of their opponents is a difficult one to support. But that didn't stop US generals and politicians from calling the Afghans hungry wolves, or saying things like, "The only thing these sand understand is force, and I'm about to introduce them to it." For a young Taliban soldier, having their masculinity validated like that must have been flattering, and they were more than happy to play along. As one Taliban fighter put it, the Americans love Pepsi Cola, we love death. Habibi. But the idea of the Taliban as a hardened 7th century death cult often misses the mark. Throughout the war, they were consistently backed by the state of Pakistan, which also happens to be a nuclear power. They shifted their position to allow for opium production because it won them the support of farmers. They lifted restrictions on schooling, films and music in regions where their support was waning. Even suicide bombing, which was something they only really started using after 2001, was something they used to dismiss as cowardly and even as an affront to Islam. And for all the horrific shit that they do, they are also perfectly happy to embrace modernity and forego their religious convictions when it suits them. And seeing them as a barbaric horde who only understand violence can take you down some very weird paths. Some of which are just downright ridiculous, like that time when the alleged nonce formerly known as Prince Andrew once said that the Council of British Colonial Wisdom could have prevented failure in Iraq. Mate. But thinking along these lines can also have very dangerous consequences. It's a common theme in the American media to portray the rules of engagement as a handicap, imposed on soldiers by pencil-pushing, desk-licking liberals, especially if their opponents are of the Arab-speaking variety. If these hard men don't have to follow a gentleman's code, why should we? And the film that takes the prize here is incidentally called The Rules of Engagement, where an American colonel is tried in court after he forgoes his duties and orders his men to open fire on a crowd of civilian protesters in Yemen.
Sir, are you ordering me to fire into the crowd? Over? Yes, goddammit! Waste the motherfuckers! 6 out! Engage! Engage! Open fire!
Plot twist, the civilians he killed were actually all armed. The women and children were armed. He was in the right to waste the motherfuckers. And even the mutilated girl we see earlier in the film and are supposed to sympathize with turned out to be a cold-blooded jihadi slayer queen. This film is so racist. But naturally, stories about hardened soldiers being inconvenienced by soft boy bureaucrats is a very seductive one. And it isn't surprising when this perspective also makes its way into the heads of people in power. In 2017, the United States government lifted the rules of engagement for airstrikes and the restrictions on the use of landmines. The hardman politicians seemed very eager to match the brutality of their enemies, and they seem to have forgotten why those rules existed in the first place. Within 1 year of lifting the restrictions, the number of civilian deaths by pro-government forces had almost doubled. Looking back at this fine gentleman's words, you can see how Western leaders have a knack of presenting themselves as civilized whilst engaging in brutality at exactly the same time. I probably don't need to spell out how that could backfire, especially given that one of the Taliban's biggest strengths is their seemingly endless supply of new recruits. As one very wise general put it, what is it we don't understand? We're going to lose this f***ing war if we don't stop killing civilians. The attempt to be just as barbaric as the enemy ends up being a godsend for Taliban propagandists. So much for the civilized West, they say. I mean, what kind of leader thinks that's a good idea? Who allows their fantasies of strength to influence their decision-making in such a bad way? Oh yeah.
I'm gonna find a general who's so good, who's so mean and so smart. I don't want just mean, I want mean and smart. You know, I know a lot of tough guys, but they're stupid.
Part 6. Conclusion. I don't know exactly what Hinduism predicted thousands of years ago, and I imagine Joe Rogan is being conveniently vague here. The problem with this trope isn't just that it's wrong, but that it's dangerously wrong. It's not just that it's reductive or simplistic, but also that it's an extremely toxic way of looking at society, and of men, that ultimately inspires some very destructive behavior. I mentioned Dune earlier, but it actually captures the trope really well. The freemen are depicted as simple but morally pure warriors molded by a life of struggle on their desert homeland. But as it was with their Germanic people, that story isn't told by the freemen themselves. It's told from an ivory tower, by a princess whose father just happens to be the emperor of the known universe. The freemen themselves see their own story in a very different way, as one of failure and exile. And they know perfectly well how much they have to rely on those big f***off worms. Just as it's more often the case in real life, the hardness of the land does a much better job at keeping invaders out than the hardness of the people living there. The example in June shows us what the story about hard men and hard times really is. It's a fairy tale told by people in a position of privilege that allows them to fantasize about a place they've never been to and probably wouldn't want to visit anyway. Maybe that's why some mad walloper decided to print the phrase on bedsheets and pillow covers, because it should never be anything more than a prompt for fairy tales that you can curl up in at night with your Phil Mitchell ASMR audiobook as you slip into sweet dreams about the hardest men in the land. And if that's the story you like, go ahead and enjoy your Joe Rogan podcasts if they make you happy, but for f***'s sake, please just remember him for what he is. He's a charming goofball who's fun to listen to sometimes. That's it. He's not an intellectual authority, and I doubt he even sees himself that way, and he's definitely not the kind of guy who should be put in charge of these things. And I've seen the kind of memes people post in his defense. It's true, maybe I'm not muscular enough to argue with Joe Rogan about things. Maybe you're okay with being one of those broken clocks who spends their entire life warning about the hard times ahead, and maybe you'll get lucky. But if you've had the freedom to make it this far through a YouTube video talking about hard men, it's probably safe to say that you're living in the good times. So enjoy them, and don't forget to stay hard. Wait, what were the women doing in all this?